A Virgin CEO kneels in the pouring rain before a fat homeless woman and says the words no one can believe. "You're built for birthing. I need sons." Everyone watching gasps. But behind that shocking moment lies something no one sees. A broken billionaire searching for meaning. And a woman the world threw away, still carrying a voice that could heal souls. He thinks he's rescuing her, but soon it's her faith that starts rescuing him. When his perfect image shatters and her dark past explodes online, both will have to decide, is love stronger than shame? Can grace rebuild what pride destroyed? And when he kneels one last time, will it be for forgiveness or forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The February morning bit into River Dane's face as he stepped out of his Tesla Model S, the Atlanta skyline, a steel grey backdrop against the winter sky. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached the pristine glass building housing Atlanta's most exclusive fertility clinic. At 38 years old, River had conquered the tech world, but time was now his most formidable opponent. The lobby's warmth did little to thaw his rigid posture. River checked his watch, 7:45 a.m. exactly. He was 15 minutes early, just as he planned. Everything in his life ran on precise schedules, from his morning protein shake to his evening review of Dane Robotics' international operations. "Mr. Dane." The receptionist's voice carried a hint of awe. "Dr. Matthews will see you now." The examination room was like everything else in River's life, sterile, organized, efficient. He sat perfectly still on the edge of the padded table, his charcoal suit barely wrinkling despite his discomfort. Dr. Matthews entered with a tablet in hand, her face carrying the careful neutrality of someone about to deliver complicated news. "Mr. Dane, thank you for coming in today. I have your test results." River nodded once, his face a mask of calm. Inside, his heart picked up speed. "I'll be direct," she said, pulling up his charts. "We've identified a rare genetic condition that could impact your fertility as you age. While you're healthy now, your window for having children is narrowing faster than average for a man your age." The words hit River like a physical blow, though his expression never changed. "How long?" "If you want to father children, I strongly recommend starting within the next year or two. After that, the chances decrease significantly." Dr. Matthews paused, studying his reaction. "If you want sons, you'll need to start now." Sons. The word echoed in River's mind. He'd built an empire of robots and artificial intelligence, but who would inherit it? Who would carry on the Dane name? "I can refer you to several excellent matchmaking services that cater to professionals in your position, Doctor," Matthews offered, misreading his silence for confusion. "That won't be necessary." River stood, straightening his jacket. "Thank you for your time." The drive back to his penthouse was a blur of traffic lights and automated navigation. His mind, usually focused on stock prices and algorithm improvements, kept circling back to one thought. Time was running out. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of Atlanta's most exclusive high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he'd helped shape with his innovations. But tonight, the vista felt empty. The sleek furniture, the state-of-the-art smart home system, the rare art pieces, all of it seemed meaningless without someone to share it with, to pass it on to. River loosened his tie and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. He never drank during the week, but tonight called for breaking routine. The amber liquid caught the light as he swirled it, creating patterns like the ones in his DNA that were now betraying him. "Sons," he whispered to the empty room. The word felt foreign on his tongue. For the first time in years, River felt truly alone. His parents had died in a plane crash when he was 25, leaving him with nothing but the family name and a small tech startup. He'd turned that startup into Dane Robotics, now worth billions. But what was the point of all this success if it ended with him? The city lights blurred as he stared out the window. His chest felt tight, like the walls of his carefully constructed world were closing in. River Dane, the man who could solve any problem with logic and code, couldn't program his way out of this one. Without conscious thought, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since his parents' funeral. He sank to his knees beside his bed, hands clasped awkwardly. "God," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I haven't been much for prayer lately. Or ever." He paused, feeling foolish but desperately needing to continue. "But I need a sign. If I'm meant to have children, show me how. Show me someone worthy of being their mother. Someone who won't raise them to be—" He swallowed hard. "Someone who won't raise them to be hollow like me." The prayer felt clumsy, inadequate. River rose, embarrassed by his moment of weakness. He was a man of science and logic, not faith and prayer. Yet as he prepared for bed, following his usual precise routine, something felt different. Like a line of code had been altered in the program of his life. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. The emptiness of the massive penthouse seemed to press in on him. Tomorrow, he would return to his world of board meetings and technological innovations. But tonight, for the first time in years, River Dane admitted to himself that success wasn't enough. He needed more than robots and algorithms. He needed a family. The thought followed him into his dreams, where faceless children ran through empty corridors of steel and glass, their laughter echoing in spaces that had never known joy. When he woke the next morning, the prayer still lingered in his mind, along with a strange feeling he couldn't quite identify. It felt like hope. The rain came down in sheets over Atlanta that morning, turning the February chill into something that cut straight to the bone. Julia Ellis huddled closer to the brick wall of Marshall's bakery, pulling her threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the vents above, making her stomach growl painfully. At 34 years old, Julia had learned to find comfort in small mercies. The bakery's warmth seeping through the wall, the awning that kept the worst of the rain off, the memory of her mother's songs that kept her spirit from completely breaking. "Love built this home," she hummed softly, her rich alto voice carrying despite the drumming rain. "Stone by stone, prayer by prayer." The familiar lyrics wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Her mother had written that hymn 20 years ago, back when their little church choir was Julia's whole world. Back before cancer took Mama, before the grief ate Julia alive, before the pills became her only friend. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the grey morning. Julia kept singing, more to herself now than anyone else. The car's back door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out, unfurling an umbrella with practiced precision. Something about him made Julia pause mid-verse. Maybe it was his ramrod-straight posture, or the way he moved like every step was calculated. He wasn't like the usual businessman who hurried past, pretending not to see her. This one had stopped, and was now staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Sir?" she asked, her voice rough from the cold. "I ain't asking for nothing, if that's what you're worried about." The man took a step closer, then another. Without warning, he knelt down beside her, holding his umbrella over them both. Rain dripped from his perfectly trimmed dark hair, and Julia could see her own reflection distorted in his steel-grey eyes. "Your voice," he said, as if those two words explained everything. Julia's defenses rose immediately. Was he mocking her? Some rich man getting his kicks by pretending to care about the fat, homeless woman singing in the rain. She'd seen enough of their kind, throwing dollars at the poor to feel better about themselves. "You're built for birthing," he blurted out, his pale face flushing. "I need sons." The words hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Julia's mouth fell open in shock, then snapped shut in anger. Around them, pedestrians had stopped to stare, phones already recording what promised to be viral entertainment. The crazy rich man proposing to the homeless woman. "Built for birthing?" Julia's voice rose, thick with fury. "What am I, some breeding cow to you?" She gathered what little strength she had and spat a mouthful of rainwater at his expensive shoes. "Just 'cause I'm big and homeless don't mean I ain't human. Get away from me, you sick—" The world tilted suddenly. Julia felt her knees give way as days of hunger and cold finally caught up with her. The last thing she saw was panic replacing the calculated look in the man's eyes as he lunged forward to catch her. Strong arms wrapped around her as consciousness faded. Through the haze, she heard him barking orders. "Call an ambulance!" Then softer, close to her ear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please be okay." Julia wanted to tell him she didn't need his help or his pity, but the darkness was too tempting. As she slipped under, her mother's hymn echoed in her mind. "Love built this home, stone by stone." But this wasn't love. She thought bitterly. This was just another rich man trying to buy what wasn't for sale. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against an expensive wool coat that smelled of cedar and guilt. Rain fell on her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. The last thing she heard before completely losing consciousness was the man's voice, still apologizing, still sounding lost despite his obvious wealth and power. The world faded to black, but not before Julia sent up a prayer of her own. "Mama, what kind of mess have I gotten into now?" Around them, the rain continued to fall on Atlanta's streets, washing away the boundary lines between their two very different worlds, if only for a moment. The hospital room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Julia's face as consciousness slowly returned. Her eyes fluttered open, immediately squinting against the brightness. The antiseptic smell hit her first, followed by the soft beeping of monitors. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt weak, like overcooked noodles. "Please don't try to move yet." A deep voice came from her right. Julia turned her head, and there he was, the man from the street. In the stark hospital lighting, she could see him more clearly now. Tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair that looked like it cost more than a month's rent at any decent apartment. His grey suit was immaculate despite their earlier encounter in the rain, suggesting he'd changed clothes. He sat rigidly in the uncomfortable hospital chair, hands clasped in his lap, watching her with those intense grey eyes. "Why am I here?" Julia's voice came out raspy. Her throat felt like sandpaper. The man reached for a paper cup of water on the bedside table. "You collapsed. Severe dehydration and malnutrition, according to the doctors." He held the cup out to her, complete with a bendy straw. Julia ignored the offered water. "I didn't ask for your help, mister." "River Dane," he supplied, still holding the cup. "And no, you didn't ask, but I couldn't very well leave you unconscious on the sidewalk." The name hit Julia like a physical blow. River Dane, the billionaire tech genius whose company logo was plastered across half of Atlanta's skyline. The man whose robots were revolutionizing everything from manufacturing to medicine. She'd seen his face in newspapers and on billboards, but those carefully staged photos hadn't captured the awkward intensity of him. "Oh, I get it now," Julia said, anger building in her chest. "This is some kind of social experiment, right? Or maybe a publicity stunt. Billionaire saves homeless woman, Proves he has a heart after all." She pushed herself up, despite the dizziness, glaring at him. "Well, I ain't your good deed for the day, Mr. Dane." River set the cup down carefully. "This isn't a publicity stunt. There are no cameras, no press. I simply wanted to help." "Help?" Julia let out a harsh laugh. "By telling me I'm built for birthing? What kind of help is that supposed to be?" A faint blush coloured River's cheeks. "I apologize for my words earlier. They were inappropriate and poorly chosen. I'm not good with people. Numbers, systems, code. Those make sense to me. People are more complicated." "Yeah, well, I ain't a system to be figured out." Julia swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the way the room spun. "And I don't need your charity. The doctors want to keep you overnight for observation," River said, standing but maintaining his distance. "Please, at least let them make sure you're stable." Julia yanked the IV from her arm, making River wince. "I'm plenty stable. What I am is leaving." "At least let me arrange transportation to a shelter." "No." Julia's voice was firm. "You don't get to feel better about yourself by fixing me, Mr. Dane. I may be homeless, but I still got my dignity." River watched as she struggled to her feet, clearly fighting to stay upright. His hands twitched at his sides, wanting to help, but knowing it would only make things worse. "I'm not trying to fix you, Ms. Ellis." "How do you know my name?" "Your medical records came up when they admitted you. Julia Ellis, 34 years old, former—" "Stop." Julia held up a hand. "Just stop. You don't get to know my story. You don't get to make me your project." She took an unsteady step toward the door. "Please," River said softly. "At least take this." He pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, holding it out to her. "If you ever need anything." Julia stared at the card, but didn't take it. "What I need is for you to leave me alone." She made her way to the door, each step a little stronger than the last, her pride holding her upright. River watched her go, the card still in his outstretched hand. Later that night, River stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The space around him was immaculate, all clean lines and modern furniture, everything in its proper place. And yet, for the first time in years, it felt wrong. Empty. He loosened his tie, remembering the way Julia had looked at him, not with the usual awe or intimidation his wealth inspired, but with a raw honesty that had stripped away all his carefully constructed barriers. Her voice echoed in his mind, not the angry words from the hospital, but the hymn she'd been singing in the rain. There had been something pure in that moment, something real. Without conscious thought, River found himself kneeling beside his bed, just as he had the night before. "God," he whispered into the silence, "I know I haven't been the most faithful servant. I've relied on logic, on my own understanding. But today I felt something different." His hands clasped together tightly. "That woman, Julia, I don't understand why, but I know meeting her wasn't random. There's a reason, a purpose. Help me understand what it is. Help me understand her." For the first time in his adult life, River felt something beyond his carefully controlled emotions. It wasn't logic or reason. It wasn't even the desperate need for heirs that had driven him to the fertility clinic. It was a certainty that defied explanation, a conviction that Julia Ellis was meant to be part of his story. Across town, Julia lay on a narrow cot in the women's shelter, listening to the sounds of other homeless women settling in for the night. The sheets were thin but clean, and she was grateful for the roof over her head. Still, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw River Dane kneeling beside her in the rain. Not the polished billionaire from the hospital, but the awkward, sincere man who had stopped to listen to her singing. His words had been wrong, terribly wrong, but there had been something in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own. Julia rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I ain't some charity case," she whispered to herself, "and I sure ain't nobody's baby, Mama." But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to River Dane than headlines and wealth. His sincerity had cracked something in her carefully constructed walls, letting in a sliver of... what? Hope? Understanding? The darkness offered no answers, only the soft sounds of breathing and the distant hum of the city. Julia closed her eyes, trying to push away thoughts of grey eyes and gentle hands and prayers whispered in the rain. But they followed her into her dreams, where her mother's hymn played on repeat, and stone by stone, something began to build. The morning sun cast long shadows across Atlanta's streets as River's car wound through the city. He hadn't slept well, his mind replaying Julia's voice over and over, not her angry words at the hospital, but that hymn in the rain. Something about it had touched a place in him he'd thought long dead. "Circle the block again, James," River instructed his driver, his eyes scanning the sidewalks. They'd been at this for 2 hours, methodically covering the areas where homeless people gathered. Each face that wasn't Julia's sent a small pang of disappointment through his chest. The car turned onto Peachtree Street, passing another church. River was about to tell James to continue when he spotted a gathering outside a modest brick building. A sign read, "Grace Street Mission, Daily Breakfast and Prayer." "Stop here," River said, his heart quickening as he recognized a familiar figure among the crowd. Julia stood on the mission steps, her large frame wrapped in a clean but worn sweater. Her hands were raised, and despite her circumstances, her face shone with an inner light that made River's breath catch. A small group of people, some clearly homeless, others wearing volunteer badges, had formed a circle around her. River stepped out of the car, staying back but close enough to hear. Julia's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "You know what?" she was saying, her tone warm and intimate despite addressing the group. "I used to think God only wanted the perfect folks, the ones with clean clothes and clean lives." She laughed, a rich sound that drew smiles from her listeners. "But then I lost everything. And you know what I found out? God doesn't use perfect people. He uses the broken so others can see his glue." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. River watched as Julia reached out to squeeze an elderly man's shoulder, her touch gentle and assured. "Look at these cracks in us," she continued, gesturing to herself and those around her. "Every single one tells a story. Every break, every mistake. That's where his light gets in. That's where his love shows up brightest." River found himself moving closer, drawn by the raw authenticity in her words. This wasn't the polished preaching he remembered from his childhood church visits. This was something else entirely. Messy and real and alive. "When you're lying on that sidewalk," Julia's voice cracked slightly, "feeling like you ain't worth the ground you're sleeping on, remember this. God's got a special thing for broken vessels. He's got a way of filling us up and making us overflow, right where we're cracked the most." She led them in a prayer, her words simple but profound. River watched as people wiped tears from their eyes, as shoulders straightened with renewed dignity. The crowd began to disperse, many stopping to hug Julia or shake her hand. River waited until the last person had moved away before approaching. His expensive shoes clicked against the concrete, drawing Julia's attention. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with wariness. "Mr. Dane," she said flatly, "come to make another inappropriate proposal." Instead of responding, River slowly, deliberately lowered himself to one knee before her. The gesture wasn't theatrical or grand. It was an act of pure humility. Julia took a step back, clearly unsettled. What are you doing? Get up before someone sees you. I didn't mean to insult you yesterday, Julia, River said quietly, looking up at her. I was clumsy with my words, but I meant what I said. You have life in you. Faith, fire. That's what my sons need. The morning breeze stirred Julia's hair as she stared down at him, something complicated moving across her face. For a long moment, she said nothing, and River remained kneeling, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. Stop embarrassing me, she finally said, but her voice had lost its edge. Something soft flickered behind her eyes, a glimpse of vulnerability beneath her protective armor. River saw it, that tiny crack in her defenses, and felt hope surge in his chest. He remained kneeling, letting the moment stretch between them. You don't know anything about me, Julia said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. I know what I heard in your voice when you were singing, River replied. I know what I just witnessed here. You have a gift for reaching people, for making them feel... He struggled to find the right words. Seen. Worthy. Julia wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that seemed more protective than cold. And what makes you think I want any part of your world, Mr. Dane? What makes you think I'm not exactly where I'm supposed to be? Because God doesn't waste broken vessels, River said softly, echoing her own words back to her. And I don't believe he brought me to hear your voice in the rain by accident. A mix of emotions played across Julia's face, surprise, uncertainty, and something that looked almost like hope. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, shaking her head. You're either crazy or desperate, she finally said, but there was less bite in her words than before. Maybe both. River admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. But I'm also sincere. Julia looked away, her gaze sweeping across the mission building, the scattered remains of the breakfast crowd, the city streets beyond. When she looked back at River, something had shifted in her expression. Get up, she said, her voice gentler than before. We can't have Atlanta's most eligible bachelor ruining his $1,000 pants on these steps. River rose slowly, brushing off his knees. They're actually $2,000, he said, then immediately winced at how that sounded. To his surprise, Julia let out a short laugh. More of a snort, really. And for the first time since they'd met, her smile reached her eyes. It transformed her face, making her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards. The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. River could feel it, the subtle shift in their dynamic, the tiny opening in the wall Julia had built around herself. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was something. A beginning. The morning sun continued to climb, casting their shadows long across the mission steps. In the distance, Atlanta's skyscrapers gleamed like promises, while here, in this humble space, two broken vessels stood facing each other, waiting to see what God's glue might make of them both. River straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of high-stakes meetings. But this wasn't a boardroom, and Julia Ellis wasn't a business partner, at least not in the traditional sense. I have a proposal for you, he said carefully, watching her expression. Not marriage, he added quickly, seeing her eyes narrow. Something different, something purposeful. Julia crossed her arms, her worn sweater pulling tight across her shoulders. I'm listening. Dane Robotics is launching a new foundation, River explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. We're focusing on underprivileged communities, providing education, job training, and support services. I want you to help lead it. Julia let out a short, harsh laugh. Me? Lead a foundation? Mr. Dane, have you looked at me lately? She gestured to her weathered clothes and unwashed hair. "I have looked at you," River said quietly. "I've seen how you connect with people, how you give them hope when they have nothing left. That's exactly what this foundation needs." The morning traffic hummed in the background as Julia studied him, her eyes sharp and questioning. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" "The chance to do something meaningful," River replied. "Something beyond profits and stock prices." He paused, then added, "And maybe the opportunity to learn from someone who understands what these communities really need." Julia's expression softened slightly, but skepticism still lined her face. "What exactly are you offering?" "Food, clothing, temporary housing," River listed. "A salary that matches the position, professional development opportunities." He met her gaze directly. "A chance to help others while helping yourself. Sounds like pity wrapped in a pretty package," Julia said, but there was less bite in her words than before. River shook his head firmly. "It's not pity, Julia, it's purpose. You have gifts that could change lives. I'm just offering you a platform to use them." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Julia turned away, her shoulders tense. "I need time to think," she said finally. "To pray about it." "Of course." River nodded. "Take all the time you need." He pulled out a business card and wrote an address on the back. "When you're ready, come here. It's a guest house near my estate. It's yours, regardless of your decision." Julia took the card hesitantly, as if it might burn her fingers. "I'll let you know tomorrow," she said. That night, Julia knelt in her corner of the shelter, the business card clutched in her hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she prayed, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is your doing, give me the strength to accept it. And if it's not, give me the wisdom to walk away." Morning found her standing at River's office, her few possessions in a worn backpack. "I'll do it," she said without preamble. "But I want to earn every penny. Honestly, no handouts, no special treatment." River's face broke into a genuine smile, the first Julia had seen from him. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The drive to the guest house was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Julia's breath caught. The house was modest by River's standards, but to her it looked like paradise, a small 2-story cottage with white trim and a wraparound porch. "It's fully furnished," River said, handing her the keys. "There's food in the kitchen and—" He hesitated. "I had some clothes delivered. I hope that's okay." Julia's hand trembled as she took the keys. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming. Clean lines, comfortable furniture, nothing ostentatious. On the bed in the master bedroom, she found neatly folded clothes, simple, practical pieces in her size. The sight brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Lord," she whispered, sinking to her knees beside the bed. "Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting me." River stood outside in the gathering dusk, watching the lights come on in the guest house windows. Each glowing pane seemed to represent a promise of redemption, of purpose, of possibility. "Maybe God just gave me my answer," he murmured, his words carried away by the evening breeze. Inside, Julia ran her hand over the clean sheets. Real sheets, on a real bed. For the first time in years, she wouldn't be sleeping on a shelter cot or a cold sidewalk. The reality of it overwhelmed her, and she sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress. The room was simple but beautiful, with soft cream walls and curtains that filtered the fading sunlight. A small desk sat in one corner, and a comfortable chair by the window invited quiet contemplation. Everything spoke of thoughtfulness, of dignity restored. Julia changed into fresh pajamas, marveling at the feeling of clean, new fabric against her skin. As she slipped between the sheets, their crisp coolness embraced her like a blessing. She laid her head on the pillow, so soft it felt like a cloud, and let out a long, shuddering breath. Tears came again, but these were different from the bitter ones she'd grown used to. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of the terrifying possibility that God hadn't finished with her story yet. Outside her window, River lingered a moment longer, watching the gentle glow of her bedroom light. In that moment, something shifted in his heart. A crack in the wall of logic and control he'd built around himself. Perhaps this strange partnership wasn't just about giving Julia a second chance. Maybe, just maybe, it was about his redemption too. The night settled around them both, Julia in her new bed, River in his solitary vigil. While above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to the quiet miracle of two broken lives beginning to heal. The glass and steel building of Dane Robotics towered against the Atlanta skyline, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Julia stood at the entrance, tugging nervously at her new navy blazer. The clothes River had provided were professional but simple, perfect for blending in if she hadn't felt so out of place. Her hands shook as she gripped her temporary employee badge. Just last week, she'd been sitting outside in the rain, and now she was walking into one of the most prestigious tech companies in the city. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming her into the climate-controlled lobby. "Miss Ellis." The security guard nodded, checking her badge. "Mr. Dane said to expect you. Please take elevator B to the 14th floor." Julia managed a weak smile and headed for the elevator. As she walked, she caught snippets of whispered conversations. "That's her. The one from the streets. Can you believe he brought her in?" What was Mr. Dane thinking? The elevator seemed to crawl between floors. Julia closed her eyes, remembering her morning prayer. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered. "Help me prove I'm worth this chance." The 14th floor buzzed with activity. Administrative assistants hurried past with tablets, while men and women in suits gathered around coffee stations. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a destination. Everyone except Julia. "Julia!" River's voice cut through her panic. He stood in the doorway of a conference room, his presence commanding yet somehow reassuring. "Perfect timing. We're about to start the foundation meeting." She followed him into the room where 12 executives sat around a polished table. Their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. "Everyone," River addressed the room, his voice firm. "This is Julia Ellis, our new outreach coordinator for the Dane Foundation. She brings valuable first-hand experience and insight to our mission. I expect you all to show her the same respect you'd show any other team member." Julia's heart pounded as she took her seat. The meeting began with budget projections and demographic studies, terms that made her head spin. When asked for input, she cleared her throat nervously. I may not understand all your numbers," she began, her voice shaky. "But I know what it's like out there. The people we're trying to help, they don't need fancy programs. They need hope. They need to know someone sees them as human beings." The room fell silent. Then Sarah Chen, the marketing director, leaned forward. "Could you elaborate on that, Miss Ellis? What specific approaches would you recommend?" Julia's nervousness faded as she spoke about her experiences, the dignity of simple kindness, the power of genuine connection. She described the informal support networks among homeless communities, the daily struggles for basic necessities, the importance of treating people with respect rather than pity. By the meeting's end, several executives were taking notes. Even those who had seemed hostile earlier were listening intently. River watched from the head of the table, a subtle smile playing at his lips. As the day wound down, River appeared at her new office, a small but bright space with a window overlooking the city. "Dinner?" he asked. "The cafeteria's still open?" Julia nodded, grateful he hadn't suggested a fancy restaurant. The company cafeteria was nearly empty at this hour. They filled their trays with soup and sandwiches, finding a quiet corner table. "You did well today," River said, stirring his soup. "Better than well, actually. You brought something to that meeting no consultant ever could. Truth." Julia wrapped her hands around her warm soup bowl. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Still am, really. It feels like a dream I might wake up from." "Tell me," River said softly. "If you're willing, tell me how you got here." The evening light softened through the cafeteria windows as Julia shared her story. She told him about her mother, a single parent who'd raised her on church hymns and unwavering faith. About her early success in gospel music, singing at churches across the South. Then came her mother's sudden illness, cancer that moved too fast for treatment. "I couldn't handle it," Julia's voice cracked. "Mama was everything to me. When she died, I lost my anchor, started taking pills to numb the pain, then stronger stuff. Lost my apartment, my friends, my music." She wiped a tear. "Spent 3 years on the streets. Would have died there if not for Miss Martha at the shelter. She helped me get clean, showed me God wasn't finished with me yet." River listened without interrupting, his soup forgotten. He saw beyond her present appearance to the strength it took to survive such loss, to keep faith through darkness. Her story moved him deeply, stirring something in his carefully ordered world. "But you never lost your voice," he said finally. "I heard it that day in the rain. That's what made me stop." Julia managed a small smile. "Mama always said, 'Baby, when you've got nothing else, you've got your voice, and you've got your prayers.' Guess she was right." They finished their meal in comfortable silence. As they cleared their trays, River noticed how Julia thanked the cafeteria worker by name, asking about his family. Such a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes about who she was. Later that night, River stood in his penthouse, looking out over the city lights. He thought about Julia's story, about strength born from brokenness. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he found himself smiling, really smiling. Not the polite expression he wore for business meetings, but something genuine and unguarded. In the quiet of his home, surrounded by all his carefully acquired successes, River realized that Julia's presence had already begun changing things. She brought humanity to his sterile world, proof that second chances weren't just corporate slogans, but real possibilities. The smile stayed with him as he prepared for bed, as natural as breathing. Something was shifting in his carefully constructed life, and for once, he welcomed the change. Down in the guest house, Julia knelt beside her bed, adding a new prayer to her nightly ritual. "Lord," she whispered, "help me be worthy of this chance, and thank you for sending someone who could see past what I was to what I might become." The city hummed around them both, its rhythm steady and sure, while inside Dane Robotics, whispers about the street woman began to change to murmurs of respect for the woman brave enough to speak truth to power. Days melted into weeks at Dane Robotics, each one bringing subtle changes to both River and Julia. The morning sun would find them in River's office, surrounded by presentation slides and spreadsheets, as he patiently explained the intricacies of corporate communication. "Remember," River would say, pointing to the screen, "data tells the story, but people connect with the heart behind it." His voice carried its usual measured tone, but there was a gentleness now that hadn't been there before. Julia nodded, scribbling notes in her worn notebook. Like when Mama used to say, "Numbers are just feelings wearing suits." She glanced up to see River's lips twitch with amusement. Their afternoons often found them in various shelters across Atlanta. Julia moved through these spaces with natural ease, greeting familiar faces and drawing out stories from the shy ones. River watched, amazed, as she connected with people he might have once walked past without a second glance. At the Southside Youth Center, Julia knelt beside a young girl clutching a tattered sketchbook. "Show Mr. Dane your drawings, honey. He needs to see what talent looks like." River, still awkward in these settings, crouched down and examined the child's artwork with genuine interest. "These are exceptional," he said softly. "We should consider an art program in the Foundation's educational initiatives." Julia's face lit up. "See? Now you're thinking with your heart instead of just your spreadsheets." Their shelter visits became the highlight of River's days. He found himself looking forward to the unscripted moments, the raw authenticity of people's stories. Julia's influence had begun to reshape his perspective, teaching him that true impact wasn't measured in profit margins, but in changed lives. During a presentation practice session, Julia struggled with technical terms. Frustrated, she tossed her notes aside. "Lord have mercy. I sound like a robot trying to speak human." River, surprising them both, let out a genuine laugh. Coming from someone who works at a robotics company, that's particularly funny. Julia stared at him, then burst into giggles. Did the mighty River Dane just make a joke? "I believe I did," he said, looking pleased with himself. "You're rubbing off on me." These moments of shared laughter became more frequent. Julia's natural humor drew out River's long-buried, playful side. Even his employees noticed the change, whispering about how their usually stoic boss had been seen smiling in the hallways. One evening, after visiting 3 schools to discuss educational programs, they found themselves hungry and tired. River's driver pulled up to a small diner called May's Place, its neon sign flickering in the dusk. "Best chicken and dumplings in Atlanta," Julia declared as they settled into a worn vinyl booth. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, brought them water in plastic cups with bent straws. When their food arrived, Julia automatically folded her hands. "Would you join me?" she asked River. He hesitated only a moment before awkwardly clasping his hands. Julia began her prayer, her voice warm and natural. "Lord, thank you for this food and for bringing good people into our lives. Bless this meal and the hands that prepared it. Amen." River's Amen followed, stilted and formal. Julia opened her eyes and grinned. "You pray like you file taxes," she teased, all proper and organized, checking off boxes with the Lord. River's face flushed, but then he started laughing, a real deep laugh that seemed to surprise even him. "I suppose I do," he admitted. "I've never been good at spontaneity." "Oh, I don't know about that," Julia said, spearing a dumpling. "That day in the rain seemed pretty spontaneous to me." They shared a look, remembering their bizarre first meeting. "God works in mysterious ways," River said softly. "Now that," Julia pointed her fork at him, "didn't sound like a tax form at all." They lingered over their meal, sharing stories and comfortable silences. River found himself opening up about his childhood, the pressure of family expectations, the loneliness of being the smart one, the way he'd buried himself in work to avoid feeling. Julia listened with the same compassion she showed to everyone, but there was something more in her eyes when she looked at him, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a kindred wounded spirit. Later that night, River walked Julia to the guest house. The evening air was soft with spring promises, carrying the scent of blooming dogwood trees. As they reached her door, Julia began to hum quietly, the melody he'd first heard in the rain. "Love built this home," she explained, catching his questioning look. "Mama wrote it when I was little. Said home isn't about walls and roofs, it's about hearts that shelter each other." River stood outside long after Julia went in, listening as her humming turned to quiet singing. The words floated through the window, wrapping around him like a gentle embrace. Love built this home, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. Something shifted in his chest, an ache both sweet and terrifying. Standing there in the gathering darkness, River Dane, the man who built empires but never a home, realized he was falling in love. The knowledge didn't come with spreadsheets or logical arguments. It came with the simple certainty of Julia's voice, singing about love building homes, while his heart built one around her. He remained there, letting the music wash over him until the last notes faded into the night. Only then did he walk back to his penthouse, carrying the melody with him like a precious secret. The late March sun streamed through the windows of Dane Robotics' conference room as Julia stared at the television crews setting up outside. In 30 days, her life had transformed from sleeping on streets to helping shape a multi-million-dollar charitable foundation. Now, the evening that would cement this change loomed before her like a mountain. "I can't do this, River," she whispered, pressing her hand against the cool glass. "All those cameras, all those people." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "They're going to see me up there and wonder what joke you're playing." River set down the event schedule he'd been reviewing and crossed the room to stand beside her. "What do you mean?" Julia gestured at herself, her voice catching. "Look at me. I'm not exactly what people expect at a fancy gala. I'm twice the size of those society ladies out there. And let's be honest, half of Atlanta probably remembers me from my worst days, singing for coins outside the 5-Point station." River's expression softened as he watched her fidget with the sleeve of her new blazer. The past month had shown him sides of Julia he never expected. Her quick mind for organization, her natural ability to connect with people, the way she could turn boardroom tension into laughter with just a few words. But beneath her confidence, old wounds still bled. "Julia," he said quietly, "do you know what I see when I look at you?" She tried to make a joke. "A charity case that got way out of hand?" "I see grace." The simple statement hung in the air between them. River continued, his voice growing stronger. "I see someone who fell but got back up, someone who never lost faith even when the world gave her every reason to. Let them see what grace looks like, Julia. Let them see what strength really means." Julia blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple." He reached out and squeezed her hand. "Just be yourself. That's more than enough." As evening approached, the Dane Robotics headquarters transformed. The normally austere lobby became an elegant ballroom with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables draped in ivory linens. Television cameras lined the walls, their red lights blinking like artificial stars. In a small office converted to a dressing room, Julia stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The dress, a deep purple creation that somehow made her curves look elegant instead of overwhelming, had been specially designed for her. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, fell in soft waves around her face. A knock at the door made her jump. "10 minutes, Ms. Ellis," called a production assistant. Julia closed her eyes and whispered her mother's favorite prayer, "Lord, use these broken pieces for your glory." The ballroom hummed with Atlanta's elite. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, all gathered to witness the launch of the Dane Foundation for Community Renewal. River stood at the podium, his usual reserve softened by genuine passion as he outlined their vision for transforming struggling neighborhoods. But words alone cannot convey the heart of this foundation, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. For that, I'd like to introduce someone who embodies everything we hope to achieve. Please welcome Julia Ellis. The spotlight swung to the side of the stage. Julia took a deep breath and stepped into its glow. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some recognized her from her days on the street. Others were simply surprised by her appearance. She felt their stares like physical touches. Then she saw River's face in the front row. He nodded slightly, and in his eyes she saw complete confidence. Not in her ability to perform, but in her ability to be herself. Julia stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm going to share a song with you tonight. My mama wrote it when I was little, and I used to sing it even when I didn't have a home to call my own. It's called Love Built This Home." The opening notes floated from the piano. Julia closed her eyes and let the familiar melody wash over her. When she began to sing, her voice filled the room with something raw and real. Hope rising from ashes, faith surviving darkness, love building bridges across impossible gaps. Love built this home brick by brick, prayer by prayer, through storms and sun grace led us there. As she sang, Julia opened her eyes to scan the crowd. What she saw made her voice grow stronger, tissues being pulled from purses, hands clasped together, heads bowed in reflection. In the front row, River sat with tears running freely down his face, making no attempt to hide them. The final note faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, not polite society clapping, but real, soul-deep appreciation that grew into a standing ovation. Julia barely registered leaving the stage. She found herself in a quiet hallway behind the ballroom, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. Footsteps behind her made her turn. River stood there, his eyes still bright with tears. Something had broken open in him. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the trembling of his hands. "Julia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." She waited, hardly daring to breathe. "When this all started, I thought I needed sons to give my life meaning, to continue my name, my legacy." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I was wrong. I don't need sons anymore. I just need faith, and you've given me that." Before Julia could respond, River's hands cradled her face with infinite tenderness. Their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home, gentle at first, then deepening with shared longing and new-found trust. The sound of continued applause filtered through the walls, but they were lost in their own world of discovery and wonder. When they finally parted, Julia rested her forehead against River's chest, feeling his heartbeat match the rhythm of her mother's song. In that moment, she understood. Sometimes grace looked like a billionaire kneeling in the rain, and sometimes it looked like a broken woman learning to sing again. But always, always, it looked like love building a home where none existed before. The morning sun barely touched Atlanta's skyline when Julia's phone started buzzing incessantly. At first she ignored it, still floating in the warm glow of last night's triumph and that tender moment with River. But the notifications kept coming, each buzz like an insistent warning. Finally she reached for her phone. The moment she saw the first headline, her heart stopped. "Dane Robotics CEO's fat beggar girlfriend, the shocking truth!" Her hands trembling, Julia scrolled through article after article. There it was. Her old mugshot from 8 years ago, her face swollen from drugs and despair, staring back at her. The headlines seemed to scream from every news site. "Riverdane's new love, ex-con and addict. From street corner to corporate suite, the woman who fooled a billionaire." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Beneath each headline, comments poured in. Gold digger alert. Look at the size of her. Is he blind? Once a junkie, always a junkie. Dane Robotics is finished. Julia's phone rang, River's name flashing on the screen. She couldn't answer, couldn't bear to hear the disappointment in his voice. Instead, she watched as social media exploded with memes and cruel jokes. Someone had dug up everything. Her arrests for possession, the times she'd been caught stealing to feed her habit, even photos of her begging outside that bakery where River first found her. At 9 o'clock sharp, her office phone rang. It was Margaret from the board's office. Emergency meeting, 10 a.m., mandatory attendance. The elevator ride to the top floor felt endless. Julia could feel eyes on her, pitying, judging, condemning. The whispers followed her down the hallway like shadows. The boardroom was packed when she arrived. River sat at the head of the table, his face tight with controlled anger. Julia slipped into a chair near the door, making herself as small as possible. "This is a disaster," Howard Chen, the head of PR, was saying. "Our stock has dropped 12 points since the markets opened. Major partners are threatening to pull out. We need damage control immediately." Another board member, Patricia Wells, spoke up. "Mr. Dane, we understand your personal investment in this situation, but the Foundation's launch was meant to strengthen our corporate image, not destroy it." "The solution is obvious," said Marcus Thompson, tapping his tablet screen. "We issue a statement distancing ourselves from Ms. Ellis. Say she misrepresented herself, that we were unaware of her criminal history. No." River's voice cut through the room like steel. "Mr. Dane, be reasonable," Patricia pleaded. "Everything we've built—" "I said no." River stood slowly, his hands pressed flat against the table. Julia Ellis has been more honest about her past than anyone in this room. She never hid who she was. She never pretended to be anything but herself. "But the company," Howard started. "The company?" River's laugh held no humor. "This company makes robots to serve humanity. Yet when faced with actual human struggle, human redemption, you want to run? What does that say about us?" Julia watched him fight for her, even as shame burned in her chest. She saw the cost of his defense in the faces around the table. The doubt, the judgment, the growing certainty that River Dane had lost his legendary logic to emotion. "I won't cut ties with Julia," River declared. "I'd rather lose everything than lose her." The words hung in the air like a confession. Julia felt them sink into her heart. Beautiful and terrible at once, because she knew what she had to do. She slipped out while the arguments continued. In her small office, she gathered her few belongings with shaking hands. Then she sat at her desk and pulled out a piece of paper. The words came slowly, each one carved from her breaking heart. "Dear River, you needed a mother for your sons. I'm not even fit to mother myself. Last night I thought Grace had finally won, but the world reminded me of who I really am and who I can never be. Thank you for showing me what love could look like. I'm sorry I couldn't be worthy of it." She left the note on his desk, knowing he wouldn't find it until dawn. It was better this way. Better to leave before she destroyed everything he'd built. The guest house felt colder than ever as she packed her clothes. Each item reminded her of River's generosity, his belief in her. The dress from the gala still hung on the bathroom door. Julia touched it one last time, remembering how it felt to sing her mother's song, to see tears in River's eyes, to believe for one shining moment that she could belong in his world. But that world wasn't meant for people like her. She'd learned that lesson on the streets. Some stains don't wash away, no matter how much grace rains down. Outside, the sun was setting. Julia shouldered her old backpack, the same one she'd carried when River first found her. She took one last look at the guest house, at the Foundation building gleaming in the distance, at the piece of sky where she'd hung her dreams. Then she walked away, humming her mother's hymn under her breath, each step heavy with the weight of love surrendered. Love built this home brick by brick, prayer by prayer. But some homes, she thought, were never meant to last. The city swallowed her as darkness fell. Behind her, the lights of Dane Robotics blazed against the night sky, while in his office, far above, River worked late into the evening, not yet knowing that his world was about to collapse with the dawn. The morning after Julia left, River sat at his desk, staring at her handwritten note until the words blurred. His phone buzzed incessantly. Urgent messages from the board, PR teams, lawyers. He ignored them all. By noon, his assistant Margaret knocked tentatively on his door. "Mr. Dane, the emergency board meeting starts in 5 minutes." River didn't move. "Cancel it." "Sir, they're already waiting in the conference room." "Then let them wait." The next day, he didn't come to work at all. Or the day after that. His vast penthouse office gathered dust as meetings went unattended, decisions unmade. The empire he'd built with such precision began to show hairline cracks. At home, his mansion felt emptier than ever. River wandered its pristine halls like a ghost, barely eating, hardly sleeping. The cleaning service came and went, but he barely noticed. Slowly, dust gathered on the sleek furniture. Mail piled up, unopened. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Patricia Wells left 17 voicemails before showing up at his door on day 12. "River, this is professional suicide," she said, standing in his cluttered living room. "The board is moving to remove you as CEO. Everything you've built." "Let them," River said quietly, looking out the window toward the guest house where Julia had stayed. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" Patricia's voice rose in disbelief. "Dane Robotics is your life's work!" River turned to her, and something in his eyes made her step back. "No, Patricia, it was my hiding place. I built robots because they were safer than people. I created an empire because it was easier than creating a home." He gave a hollow laugh. "And now the one person who showed me what I was missing. I lost her too." After 3 weeks, the board made it official. River Dane was removed as CEO of Dane Robotics. The news made headlines across the tech world. "Tech genius has mental breakdown," and "Love affair destroys billionaire's empire." But River felt strangely peaceful as he watched his company's stock plummet. The ambition that had driven him for so long had burned away, leaving something rawer but more real in its place. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows, River found himself drawn to the guest house. He hadn't been inside since Julia left. Her presence lingered in every corner, the kitchen where she'd sung while cooking, the small desk where she'd practiced her presentations, the worn armchair where she'd read her Bible every morning. On the bedside table, partially hidden under a stack of papers, he found a notebook he'd never seen before. The cover was weathered leather, the pages dog-eared and water-stained. Opening it, he recognized Julia's flowing handwriting. It was filled with hymns, some copied from memory, others original compositions. Many were her mother's songs, carefully preserved. River's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Each one held pieces of Julia's heart, her journey from grace to darkness and back again. The last entry caught his eye. It was dated the night of the gala, just hours before everything fell apart. "Love built this home when pride tore it down. Grace raised these walls from broken ground. Every scar and every stone tells the story of how love built this home." Below the verse, Julia had written, "Mama always said God uses our mistakes to build his masterpieces. Maybe that's what he's doing with me and River, building something beautiful from our brokenness." River closed the notebook gently, pressing it to his chest. For the first time since Julia left, He knew what he had to do. The next morning, he packed a single bag: clothes, Julia's notebook, and the umbrella he'd first offered her that rainy day outside the bakery. He left his phones, his credit cards, his keys to the mansion. In the kitchen, he wrote a note to his housekeeper. "Take care of things. I'll be back when I find her." The streets of Atlanta felt different on foot. River walked for hours, visiting every shelter and mission where he and Julia had worked together. At each stop, he showed her picture, described her voice, her laugh, the way she could make anyone feel seen and valued. Some remembered her. The singing lady, yeah, she came through last week, didn't stay long. She helped serve breakfast 2 days ago, seemed real sad about something. Think I saw her heading toward Ebenezer Baptist Church yesterday morning. River followed each lead, walking until his feet ached, then walking further. He visited churches during services, hoping to hear her voice rising above the choir. He sat in soup kitchens and listened to conversations, waiting to catch her laugh or one of her gentle jokes. The rain came and went, soaking him to the skin. His expensive shoes wore thin. His designer clothes grew wrinkled and stained. But for the first time in his life, Riverdane looked people in the eye as he passed them on the street. He saw their humanity, their struggles, their dignity, all the things Julia had tried to teach him. At night, he found cheap motels or, when those were full, shelter beds. He ate at diners and food banks, making conversation with people he would have ignored just months ago. Each person had a story, a dream, a battle they were fighting. Just like Julia. Just like him. "You're different now," an old woman told him at a downtown mission. "I remember when you came here with Julia. Back then you stood apart. Now you sit with us, break bread with us." River smiled, helping her carry her tray. "Julia taught me that grace isn't about standing apart. It's about sitting together." The woman patted his hand. "Keep looking, son. A love like that's worth finding." And so he searched, carrying Julia's hymn notebook like a map to her heart, following the trail of her kindness through the city that had first brought them together. The empire he'd built crumbled behind him, but with every step, every conversation, every moment of connection, River felt something new being built in its place, something that felt a lot like home. The late March wind cut through River's thin jacket as he made his way down Ellis Avenue. 3 weeks had passed since he'd left his mansion, and his expensive clothes now hung loose on his frame. His polished shoes were scuffed from miles of searching, but he barely noticed anymore. At St. Mary's soup kitchen, he tied on an apron and took his place behind the serving counter. The steam from the huge pots of vegetable soup warmed his face as he ladled portions into bowls. His hands, once soft from board meetings and luxury, had grown calloused from washing dishes and carrying boxes of donations. "You're getting better at that," said Martha, an elderly volunteer who'd been there 20 years. "First day you came in, you splashed soup everywhere." River smiled, remembering how awkward he'd felt. Julia would have laughed at that. Martha's eyes softened. "She used to volunteer here, before her troubles started. Then again after you helped her get back on her feet." "What was she like?" River asked, his heart aching for any new detail about Julia. "Oh, she'd sing while she worked. Made up little songs about hope and second chances. Even at her lowest, she'd tell folks, 'Love ain't lost, just wandering.'" Martha patted his arm. "She said those same words when she came through here last week." River nearly dropped his ladle. "Last week. Which day?" "Tuesday morning. But she didn't stay long. Said she was heading to New Life Mission over on Highland Street." River spent his evening at New Life Mission, but Julia had already moved on. The pattern repeated day after day, always one step behind her, following a trail of changed lives and grateful hearts. At Covenant House, a teenage girl named Sarah showed him a small cross necklace. Julia gave me this when I told her I was scared to go to rehab, said God's love is bigger than any addiction. At Grace Street Shelter, a middle-aged man named Marcus described how Julia had prayed with him during a panic attack. She just sat there for 2 hours, singing soft and holding my hand. Saved my life that night. Every story painted a clearer picture of Julia's impact. She wasn't just surviving on the streets, she was ministering, healing, continuing their foundation's work even without resources or recognition. The search took its toll. River's feet developed blisters, then calluses. His designer watch stopped working. His phone remained off, buried at the bottom of his backpack. He slept wherever he could, shelter beds when available, park benches when they weren't. One particularly cold evening, he found himself in Piedmont Park. The bench was hard beneath him, but exhaustion won out over discomfort. As he drifted off, the wind carried fragments of melody. Or perhaps it was just his dreams. In his sleep, he heard Julia's voice, clear and strong, singing her mother's hymn. Love built this home when pride tore it down. Grace raised these walls from broken ground. The dream shifted, and he saw her as she'd been that first morning, rain-soaked but dignified, her voice carrying truth through the storm. Then she was at the Foundation Gala, bringing hundreds to tears with her testimony. Finally, she appeared as he'd last seen her, writing that goodbye note, tears falling on the paper. River woke with wet cheeks, the dawn light painting the park in soft gold. An elderly man was setting up his cart nearby, preparing to sell coffee and pastries to morning joggers. "Rough night, son?" the vendor asked, offering River a steaming cup. River accepted gratefully, his hands shaking slightly. "I had a dream about someone I'm looking for." The vendor nodded wisely. "Sometimes we find things better when we stop searching so hard. Like my wife always said, let your heart do the looking." River sipped the coffee, letting its warmth spread through him. Something had changed during the night. The desperate edge of his search had softened into something deeper, more peaceful. He reached into his backpack and pulled out Julia's hymn notebook. The pages had grown even more worn from his nightly readings. But now, instead of aching with loss when he read her words, he felt a quiet certainty. Each person he'd met, each story he'd heard, had shown him what real faith looked like. It wasn't about perfect prayers or polished appearances. It was about loving people exactly where they were, about seeing God's image in every face, even the ones society tried to ignore. Julia had taught him that long before he'd been ready to learn it. Now, sleeping on park benches and serving in soup kitchens, he was finally understanding. He hadn't found Julia yet, but he'd found something else, the faith he'd prayed for that first night in his sterile penthouse. It had come not through success or control, but through losing everything and discovering what remained. Rising from the bench, River straightened his rumpled clothes. Another day of searching lay ahead, but the desperate panic had faded. He would keep looking, keep serving, keep listening to the stories of lives Julia had touched. Because she was right. Love wasn't lost. It was just wandering, finding its way home. A group of shelter residents recognized him as he approached the building. "Brother River!" they called out. "Coming to help with breakfast?" "Yes," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "And maybe you can tell me more stories about Julia while we work." They welcomed him in, this man who had once built empires of steel and silicon, but was now learning to build something far more precious, a home for his heart, founded on faith and furnished with grace. The morning sun streamed through the shelter windows as River tied on an apron, ready to serve. Somewhere in the city, Julia was doing the same thing. And somehow, he knew that was enough for now. The sunrise painted Atlanta's skyline in shades of rose and gold that Easter morning. River walked the quiet streets, his designer clothes long since replaced by worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt. 3 months of searching had changed him. His face was thinner, tanned by days spent outdoors, but his eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before. The morning air carried something familiar. Music. Not the polished hymns from grand churches, but raw, soulful voices lifted in harmony. River stopped, his heart quickening. He knew that sound. More importantly, he knew the voice leading it. Following the melody, he wound through side streets until he reached an old brick church. The sign out front read, "New Life Women's Recovery Center." Through open windows, the singing grew stronger, and River's hands began to tremble. Julia's voice soared above the others, carrying the words of her mother's hymn. Love built this home when pride tore it down. Grace raised these walls from broken ground. Every crack filled with mercy's light. Every window shows heaven's sight. River's feet carried him up the worn steps. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with morning light streaming through stained glass. Wooden pews held scattered listeners, volunteers, recovery center residents, and a few early churchgoers. And there, at the front, stood Julia. She looked different, healthier, with color in her cheeks, and a gentle roundness that spoke of regular meals. Her hair was neatly styled, and she wore a simple Easter dress in spring yellow. But it was more than physical changes. She stood straighter, shoulders back, head high. This was a woman who had found her purpose. Before her, 24 women in recovery center uniforms formed an impromptu choir. Their voices weren't perfect, but they sang with the passion of those who knew the word's truth firsthand. River moved silently down the aisle, tears filling his eyes. The song wrapped around him, carrying memories of board meetings where Julia's honesty cut through corporate pretense, of late-night conversations in the company cafeteria, of her voice lifting prayers over simple diner meals. As the final verse began, one of the choir members noticed him. Her gasp rippled through the group. Julia, caught in the music, continued for a moment before registering the change. Her eyes opened, scanning the faces before her, and found River. The note she was holding wavered, then broke. The other women's voices faded to whispers, then silence. River didn't hesitate. Just as he had that first rainy morning outside the bakery, he fell to his knees. Not from awkwardness this time, but in humble recognition of God's perfect timing. "River," Julia's voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" He looked up at her, letting her see everything in his face. The months of searching, the lessons learned, the pride stripped away, and the love that had only grown stronger through absence. "Finding home," he said softly. The words echoed in the hushed sanctuary. Some of the women watching had tears in their eyes. Others smiled knowingly. They'd heard about the billionaire who gave up everything to search for the woman who taught him about grace. Julia gripped the music stand before her, her knuckles white. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I've been everywhere else," River said, still kneeling. "Every shelter, every mission, every recovery center in Atlanta. Following your trail, hearing your stories. Did you know there's a woman at Trinity Mission who still talks about how you sat with her all night during a panic attack?" Julia's eyes welled with tears. "That was just grace," River finished. "Everything you do is grace. I thought I was rescuing you that first day, but God sent you to rescue me, to show me what real strength looks like, what real faith does." A tear slid down Julia's cheek. "I left because I was ashamed, because I thought I'd ruin everything you'd built." "You built something better," River said. "Look around you. This choir, these women, every person you've helped. That's a legacy worth more than any company." The morning sun streamed through the stained glass, painting the scene in jewel tones. Outside, church bells began to ring, announcing Easter services across the city. But inside the Recovery Center chapel, time seemed suspended as River and Julia looked at each other across a space filled with 3 months of growth, learning, and grace. One of the choir members, an older woman with silver hair, stepped forward. "Julia, honey, this man's been coming to our shelter every week, serving meals, listening to stories, just hoping to find you. And every time he comes, he asks us to teach him another verse of your mama's song." Julia's eyes widened. "You learned the song?" River nodded. "All 6 verses, though I still pray like I file taxes." A laugh bubbled up through Julia's tears at the callback to their shared joke. Other women in the choir chuckled too, the tension breaking. "Stand up," Julia said finally, her voice stronger. "I told you before, a man like you doesn't need to kneel to anyone." "A man like me needs to kneel more often," River replied, but he rose, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not the same person who offered you that umbrella 3 months ago. That man thought he could control everything, even God's plan. He thought he needed sons to leave a legacy." "And now?" Julia asked softly. "Now I know that legacy isn't about what we build. It's about who we love, and how we love them." He gestured to the choir, to the recovery center around them. "You've been building a legacy of love all along. I just needed to lose everything to see it." The elderly choir member nudged Julia forward. "Go on, child. Easter's about new beginnings, ain't it?" Julia stepped down from the platform, her hands clasped tightly together. "I'm still not perfect," she warned. "Still struggling, still learning." "Good," River said. "So am I. Maybe we can learn together." He reached out slowly, offering his hand, not to pull her up this time, but to meet her as an equal. Around them, the recovery center residents and early morning worshippers watched with held breath, witnesses to a moment of restoration. Julia stood trembling before River, her heart pounding in her chest. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the worn wooden floor of the recovery center. River took a deep breath, his usual composure cracking. "When you left, my world fell apart, but it needed to fall apart. I spent weeks searching for you, and in that time, I lost everything I thought mattered. My company, my position, my reputation. The board voted me out after I refused to denounce you." "River, no!" Julia's eyes widened in horror. "Your life's work." He shook his head, a gentle smile playing at his lips. "My life's work was building empty things, glass towers and metal machines. But you build living things, hope, faith, second chances." The women of the recovery center watched in reverent silence as River continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Every shelter I visited, every person I met, they all had stories about you. The woman you helped get clean, the teenager you prayed with all night, the old man whose feet you washed when no one else would touch him." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought I was so important with my billions, but you've touched more lives than I ever did." Julia wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "I just did what needed doing, what Mama taught me." "That's exactly it," River said earnestly. "You see needs others miss. You love without conditions. When I first met you, I was looking for someone to give me sons, to continue my bloodline. I was so caught up in legacy that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. And now," Julia's voice was barely a whisper, "now I understand that real legacy isn't about DNA, it's about what we plant in others' hearts." He gestured to the women around them. "These are your children, Julia. every person you've helped, every life you've touched. They're the sons and daughters of your faith." One of the choir members sniffled loudly, and several others dabbed at their eyes. The morning sun had risen higher, filling the room with golden light. "I've been praying," River continued, his voice growing stronger. "Really praying, not just reciting words. Every night I asked God to help me find you. But more than that, I asked him to help me understand what he was trying to teach me through you." Julia's hands twisted together nervously. "And what was that?" "That I was looking for the wrong kind of inheritance. I thought I needed sons of my own blood to carry on my name, but what I really needed was to learn how to love like you do, freely, completely, without counting the cost." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "These past months have changed me, Julia. I'm not the same man who offered you that umbrella. That man was trying to buy what can only be given freely." "River," Julia protested weakly, "I'm still not worthy. I'm still broken, still struggling." "So am I," he interrupted gently. "But maybe that's the point. You taught me that God doesn't use perfect people. He uses the broken ones so others can see his glue." A few of the women murmured in recognition of Julia's familiar teaching. She glanced at them, seeing encouragement in their faces. River continued, his voice growing more passionate. "You were right that first day, Julia. You are built for birthing, but not the way I thought. You birth faith in cynics like me. You birth hope in the hopeless. You birth grace in hearts that have forgotten how to feel." He stood straighter, squaring his shoulders. "I still need sons, Julia, but I need you more. I need your kind of faith, your kind of love. I need the way you see the world and the people in it. I need your voice singing, 'Love built this home,' until I really understand what that means." As if on cue, one of the choir members began humming the familiar tune. Others joined in, their voices rising soft and sweet in the morning air. The melody wrapped around River and Julia like a gentle embrace. Julia's tears fell freely now. "But what about your company? Your life's work?" "My life's work is just beginning," River said firmly. "If you'll help me, we could expand this recovery center, open more like it. Use what's left of my resources to build real homes, not just buildings, but places where broken people can heal." He stepped forward and took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer at all if you don't want to. But I love you, Julia Ellis. I love your strength and your vulnerability. I love your faith and your doubt. I love the way you see Jesus in every person you meet, even when they can't see him themselves." The choir's harmonies swelled softly, filling the space with holy reverence. Some of the women swayed gently, their eyes closed in prayer or emotion. Julia looked down at their joined hands, his still bearing the calluses of privilege, hers marked by years of struggle. Such different paths that had led them here, to this moment. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared I'll let you down, scared I'll fail." "Then we'll fail together," River said simply, "and get back up together. That's what family does." The word family hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. The choir's voices grew stronger, the familiar words of "Love built this home," wrapping around them like a blessing. Julia looked up into River's eyes, seeing nothing but truth and love there. All her doubts, all her fears seemed to melt away in the face of such certainty. With a sob that was half laugh, half cry, she stepped forward and collapsed into his waiting arms. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes." River held her close, his own tears falling freely now. The choir's voices rose in joyful celebration, their song filling every corner of the recovery center with hope and promise. Around them, the women who had become Julia's family clapped and cheered, their own stories of redemption echoing in this new chapter of grace. In that moment, as the Easter morning sun streamed through the windows and the choir sang of love-building homes, both River and Julia understood that this was what they had been searching for all along, not a perfect life, but a perfect love that could transform their broken pieces into something beautiful. The Recovery Center's chapel buzzed with excitement on a warm spring morning. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across wooden pews that had been lovingly polished by the residents. Paper flowers, crafted by the women in art therapy, decorated every surface in shades of white and gold. Inside the small bridal room, Julia Ellis stood before a mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The women from the recovery center had worked for weeks on her dress, a simple white cotton creation with delicate lace trim they'd salvaged and restored. Each stitch represented hours of love and dedication from women who had once been strangers but were now family. "You look like an angel," whispered Maria, one of the residents who had helped with the dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted Julia's veil, a gesture that spoke of her own journey to recovery. Julia touched the fabric softly. "My mama would have loved this dress." Her voice caught. She always said fancy didn't mean beautiful. Love makes things beautiful. Pastor Jeremiah Collins knocked gently on the door. His weathered face creased into a warm smile when he saw Julia. "Child, you're glowing with God's grace today." Julia hugged him tightly. "Thank you for agreeing to perform the ceremony. It wouldn't feel right without you here." "Wouldn't miss it for the world." He chuckled. Who else would keep River from fainting? In another room, Riverdane stood adjusting his simple black tie. He'd chosen to wear a modest suit rather than anything designer, a deliberate choice that reflected how much he'd changed. Gone was the man obsessed with appearances and control. In his place stood someone humbled by love and transformed by faith. Two teenage boys burst into the room, their dress shirts already coming untucked. Liam and Carter, brothers from the local group home where River and Julia had been volunteering, couldn't contain their excitement. "River!" 13-year-old Carter called out. "Is it time yet?" "Almost." River smiled, helping 15-year-old Liam straighten his collar. The boys had stolen his heart weeks ago during a mentoring session. Their quick minds and resilient spirits reminded him so much of himself at that age, before money and success had hardened his heart. The chapel filled quickly with an unusual congregation. Women from the recovery center sat beside teens from various outreach programs. There were no corporate executives, no media, no society photographers. Instead, the pews held people whose lives had been touched by Julia's faith and River's newfound generosity. When the piano began playing, everyone stood. The back doors opened, and Julia appeared with Pastor Jeremiah. River's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't wearing designer silk or imported lace, but she radiated a beauty that no amount of money could buy. It was the beauty of redemption, of second chances, of love that builds instead of breaks. Julia walked slowly down the aisle, squeezing Pastor Jeremiah's arm for support. Each step brought her past faces she knew, women she'd prayed with during their darkest moments, teens she'd counseled through tough decisions. Their eyes shone with tears of joy, their smiles reflecting back the love she'd freely given. When she reached River, he took her hands in his. They trembled slightly, and she squeezed them reassuringly. Pastor Jeremiah began the ceremony with a warm smile. "We gather today to witness a miracle," he said, his deep voice filling the chapel. Not just the miracle of two hearts joining, but the miracle of grace that brought them here. River and Julia's story reminds us that God's love often comes disguised as our greatest challenges. The ceremony continued with readings and prayers, but the most powerful moment came when Julia stepped towards the piano. This was the part she'd insisted on, singing her mother's hymn one final time as a single woman. Her fingers found the familiar keys, and the first notes of "Love Built This Home" filled the chapel. Her voice, clear and strong, carried years of pain and triumph in every word. When walls come tumbling down, and pride has worn its crown, that's when love builds a home. To everyone's surprise, River's voice joined hers on the second verse. He'd been practicing in secret, wanting to share this moment with her. His voice wasn't perfect, but it carried sincerity that brought fresh tears to Julia's eyes. The congregation, moved by the moment, began joining in. Voices that had once cried out in despair now rose in celebration. The women from recovery, the teens from the streets, the volunteers and counselors, they all sang together, creating a symphony of second chances. As the last notes faded, Pastor Jeremiah continued with the vows. River and Julia had written their own, simple but profound promises to each other. Julia. River's voice was thick with emotion. I promise to build a home with you, not of marble and gold, but of faith and grace. I promise to remember that our broken pieces make the most beautiful mosaics when God puts them together. I promise to love you not in spite of our scars, but because of the strength they represent. Julia wiped tears from her eyes before speaking her vows. River, I promise to remind you every day that love builds the strongest homes. I promise to keep singing, even when the world tries to silence us. I promise to help you see God's grace in every face we meet, just as you helped me see it in myself again. They exchanged simple gold bands, a deliberate choice over the expensive jewelry River could have afforded. These rings symbolized not wealth, but worth, not status, but commitment. By the power vested in me, Pastor Jeremiah proclaimed with joy, and by God's amazing grace, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Before they could kiss, Liam and Carter couldn't contain themselves any longer. They ran forward, throwing their arms around both River and Julia. The congregation laughed and applauded at the spontaneous display of affection. Julia looked at the boys, then at River, her eyes twinkling. Looks like you got your sons after all, she whispered. River laughed through his tears, holding both boys close while keeping one arm around his new wife. The four of them stood there, an unlikely family formed by grace, while the congregation erupted in cheers and hallelujahs. The chapel filled with joy as people stood, clapping and celebrating. Women who had once been lost to addiction now stood tall and proud, their recovery medals pinned to their dresses. Teens who had found hope through River and Julia's mentoring wiped away tears, their futures brighter than they'd ever imagined. Pastor Jeremiah raised his hands for silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Dane and their family. The piano struck up again, and this time everyone joined in singing Love Built This Home as River, Julia, and the boys walked back down the aisle together. Their faces shone with the kind of happiness that only comes from finding not just what you wanted, but what you truly needed all along. 6 months after the wedding, the Atlanta summer painted golden light across the wraparound porch of the Ellis Dane home. River sat in the old wooden rocking chair, cradling 3-month-old Hope in his arms. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb as he hummed softly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Inside the house's converted music room, Julia led choir practice with 12 women from the foundation. Their voices carried through the open windows, sweet and strong. Each of these women had their own story of redemption, former addicts, survivors of abuse, mothers fighting to rebuild their lives. Now they stood tall, their voices rising in harmony. The Love Built This Home Foundation, renamed after Julia's mother's hymn, had become a beacon of hope in Atlanta. River had surprised everyone by stepping down as CEO of Dane Robotics, choosing instead to work alongside Julia full-time. "Some empires are built with steel," he'd told the press. "Others are built with grace." Liam and Carter burst through the screen door, their adoption certificates freshly framed and hanging proudly in the living room. At 13 and 15, they'd brought new life to the house, filling it with laughter and the occasional chaos that comes with teenage boys. "Dad," Liam called out, the word still new and precious on his tongue. "Can we show the new kids the basketball court tomorrow?" River nodded, smiling at the mention of their 3 foster children who'd arrived last week. The house that had once echoed with his lonely footsteps now rang with the sounds of family. "Just remember what Mom said," Carter added, grinning. "No showing off too much." Julia's voice floated through the window, leading the choir in the bridge of her mother's hymn. River closed his eyes, remembering that rainy day outside the bakery when he'd first heard her sing. How far they'd come from that moment, from his awkward proposal to her angry rejection, from scandal to redemption, from emptiness to abundance. The foundation now operated 3 recovery homes for women, 2 youth centers, and a job training program. But more than that, it had become a family, a place where the forgotten could find belonging, where the broken could discover wholeness. Hope stirred in River's arms, her dark eyes opening to watch the ceiling fan spin lazily above. She had Julia's eyes and River's serious expression, a perfect blend of them both. The doctors had called her conception miraculous, given River's condition. They'd named her Hope because that's what she represented, not just for them, but for everyone who thought second chances were impossible. Inside, the music swelled as Julia led the choir into the final chorus. River's deep baritone joined in from the porch, harmonizing with her familiar melody. "When walls come tumbling down, and pride has worn its crown, that's when love builds a home." The women's voices rose and fell like waves of grace, filling the evening air with promise. Through the window, River could see Julia conducting, her face radiant with joy. She caught his eye and smiled, that same smile that had melted his rigid heart all those months ago. The song came to its final verse, the one that had become their family's anthem. "Grace built this home, and love will keep it standing, through storms and peace, through all life's understanding." As the last notes faded into the twilight, Julia stepped onto the porch. She took Hope from River's arms, kissing their daughter's forehead before settling into the rocking chair beside him. The women filed out through the front door, each stopping to hug Julia and River before heading home. "You know," Julia said softly, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude. "He gave me his name, but God gave me my purpose to prove that love can still find the forgotten." The house glowed behind them, windows warm with light and life. Inside, Liam and Carter were setting the table for dinner, laughing with their foster siblings. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen where their newest house mother, a recovered addict named Sarah, was teaching the teens to bake. This home stood as testimony to divine redemption, a place where a lonely billionaire and a homeless gospel singer had found not just each other, but a calling greater than themselves. Every crack in its foundation had been filled with grace, every broken piece transformed into something beautiful. The porch lights flickered on automatically as darkness fell, casting a gentle glow over the family gathered there. River reached for Julia's hand, squeezing it gently. Together they watched the first stars appear, their hearts full with the knowledge that love had indeed built this home, and by grace it would stand forever. "Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.